What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I have an X-Men book that I want to talk to you about. X-Men, No More Humans. This is an original graphic novel written by Mike Carey and drawn by Salvador Larroca. The story is that one day the X-Men wake up and the entire human species has completely vanished, and they all have to work together. Wolverine and his group of X-Men have to work with Cyclops and his group of X-Men, and they're all working with Magneto, who has recently gone his separate way from both teams, and they all have to work together to try and figure out what's going on, what happened to the human species, and see if they can restore the status quo, bring the humans back to Earth so that there's, nothing going on right now. And we find out that the perpetrator behind this is Reyes, Mystique, and Wolverine's son from the future, who is basically just evil and crazy and just wants to get himself killed by the X-Men. At least that's Magneto's diagnosis. And so this book is a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, I really loved Mike Carey's X-Men run that lasted like 6 years, starting around 2006 or so. I really loved his X-Men run a lot, and that was really what gave me hope that this book was going to be good, because Mike Carey is writing it. Unfortunately, I feel like Mike Carey is hampered by the status quo of the X-Men comics from after Avengers vs. X-Men. Basically, Avengers vs. X-Men ends with Cyclops and a small group of mutants basically acting very militant. They are categorized here as refugees from the government, and that's probably the best way to describe them. A less nice way of describing it would be calling them terrorists. Some people who like Cyclops, they would say, no, he's not a terrorist. I would say, yeah, he kind of is. You could say that they are whatever you want to call them. It doesn't really matter, but basically in the post-Avengers vs. X-Men comics, you've got two separate factions of X-Men, and they do not like each other. And it seems like after Avengers vs. X-Men, 80% of Brian Michael Bendis' X-Men comics involve these two factions constantly butting heads with each other and arguing about, I hate you, well, I hate you, but not really getting anywhere with their arguments. I read 4 of Brian Michael Bendis' X-Men books, and I think that was 900% of what was going on in his X-Men run. And while I haven't read every single X-Men comic that came out after Avengers vs. X-Men, it seems like that is the majority of the status quo of the post-Avengers vs. X-Men comics. This book comes out in that status quo, and so it has to deal with that status quo. And I don't like the X-Men acting like toddlers who hate each other. I really don't like that. I would be perfectly fine with Cyclops and his team kind of having a schism from the rest of the X-Men, and they have slightly different goals, but whenever they have to work together in a situation like this, they can all get past their differences and work together without arguing with each other all the time. And this book gets halfway to that point. They are able to work together. There's one scene that I really like in this book where a group, half composed of Wolverine and his team and half composed of Cyclops and his team, they are teleported somewhere where they are about to die, and all of these guys are able to work together without calling each other names and threatening to kill each other, and that was really good, and I miss that about the X-Men. And to be fair, that might be how the X-Men comics are going on now in the post-Secret Wars universe. I don't know. I haven't read any of the X-Men comics from after Secret Wars, but what little I have seen makes it look like the X-Men don't hate each other as much as they did after Avengers vs. X-Men. So that's something for me to look forward to. But this book did not come out after Secret Wars. If it had, I might have enjoyed it a lot more, because it might have been set in a world where the X-Men aren't constantly at each other's throats arguing about who's right and who's wrong. But since it did come out after Avengers vs. X-Men, I feel like it spends way too much of its time dealing with all of that Cyclops versus Wolverine nonsense that I just want to see these characters get past. And it feels like I've seen them get past that at least twice, and then here they are once again at each other's throats. And I don't like that. Also, this book almost functions as a sequel to the big X-Men crossover that came out around 2013, I think, Battle of the Atom. I haven't read Battle of the Atom. It is by and large, it's a Brian Michael Bendis story because like 2/3 of it was written by Bendis, and I don't like Brian Michael Bendis. Most of what he writes, I think, is really bad, mostly just decompressed, but also he fundamentally does not understand the X-Men, and I will fight anyone who disagrees with me on that. And so after reading 4 volumes of his X-Men work, I said, you know what, I am done. I do not have to keep buying X-Men books that I know I am going to hate just to have a complete X-Men collection. I don't have to be a completist anymore, and I will thank Brian Michael Bendis for making me come to that understanding, I guess you could say. I do not have to seek out these comics that I know I'm going to hate just to fill my collection up. And so I will not ever read Battle for the Atom unless I just found it for free on the ground somewhere and I could just take it without paying any money at all. That's really the only situation where I would want to read Battle of the Atom. This book is kind of a sequel to that because the main guy who's kind of the catalyst for this entire story is a character who's left over from Battle of the Atom. He is Mystique and Wolverine's psychotic son from the future. I don't really know anything about him other than he's crazy and he wants the X-Men to kill him, or at least that's what Magneto says. And I don't like that this is an original graphic novel. This book, more than anything else coming out from Marvel Comics, should be targeting people who are not familiar with all of those books on my bookshelf behind me. This book should be targeting the people who just recently watched X-Men Days of Future Past and have never read another X-Men comic in their life. This should be prominently displayed in the Books A Million or the Barnes & Noble, and this should really be grabbing at people who really like the X-Men movies and they want to read X-Men comics, but they don't want to understand or try to comprehend 50 years of X-Men continuity. And you can have this be set in the X-Men 616 universe. You can have Wolverine and Cyclops saying, I don't like you, and you can have them be in separate teams. That's easy enough to understand for somebody who's never read an X-Men comic before. What's problematic is you've got this guy named Reyes, and Mystique is talking to him saying, I don't think you're my son. And then the X-Men are talking about him like they fought him before, but this makes no reference to the events of Battle of the Atom. And I haven't read Battle of the Atom. I still don't know the full story behind what happened in Battle of the Atom. Somebody who has never read an X-Men comic before is probably going to be even more confused than I am. And I feel like you could have had a brand new character somehow accidentally trigger this device. Maybe it doesn't even have to be somebody who is deliberately getting rid of the entire human species. What if it's just some dude at this science lab who accidentally turns it on and then all of the human species is gone? You'd have to structure your story quite a bit differently to do that, but I feel like something like this that is meant to be more new reader friendly than, say, anything from Brian Michael Bendis' X-Men run, really should try a lot harder to not be so steeped in the continuity that is going to be very off-putting to anyone who's never read an X-Men comic. And I think including a character from Battle of the Atom and not implying right up front, hey, if you've never read any X-Men comics, you should probably go read Battle for the Atom. Even if that story is really terrible, which it doesn't look very good to me, having not read it, even if that story is really terrible, you should at least give your new audiences who've never read an X-Men comic the opportunity to say, hey, go read that. In fact, this book has, at the very end of it, a free digital code for this story, and that's something that has always confused me. If I just bought this book, which I didn't, I got it as a gift, but if I just bought this book, do you really think that I need a digital code of this book? I already have a copy. It's right here in my hands, and I understand some people will take their digital codes and trade them with their friends. Like, if you went and bought that Spider-Man original graphic novel with the Kingpin on the cover, and I bought X-Men No More Humans, and you wanted to read this and I wanted to read that, we could trade our digital codes and it would work fine. The problem is, I don't know anyone in person who reads comic books, so that doesn't really work for me. If it was me behind all of this, I would say, instead of including a digital code for X-Men No More Humans, why don't you include a digital code for, like, the first half of X-Men Battle of the Atom? Even though that story is like 3 times longer than this book, and you may not want to include the digital code for the entire story, just give a sampling of that story so that people who have never read an X-Men comic, they can go and read that story because it's something different than what they've already paid money for, and if they like it, then they may go and buy the entire story or something like that. That's just a little mini rant over all of the digital comics thing that Marvel does. Don't include a digital code for the story that I just bought. That's like, I don't know, when you buy a movie and then they say, hey, you could also have a digital copy of this movie on your computer. Why would I do that? I already have the movie. I just bought it. That's just common sense to me, but a lot of other people, they are much more into this whole digital comics thing than I am, so I'm clearly not the target audience for this. And speaking of not being the target audience, unfortunately, I have to say that I am not really digging this book. I like the art. I should mention that. Salvador Larroca is hit or miss with me. Back when he was drawing Peter Milligan's run on X-Men about around 2005 or so, I really wasn't digging his art there. It felt like he was kind of getting tired of it, like he was getting burnt out. Here, I feel like his art is a step above what he was doing back in 2005, even back in the late 90s. I feel like his art is almost unrecognizable. It feels like it's a new style. There are times where I can tell that it's Larroca, but I like what he's doing here. And I like Mike Carey. I don't think that this book is making me dislike his work where I was really enjoying it before. I just think that Carey was he was forced to work within a status quo that he had nothing to do with. This is something that he had to work within the context of Bendis' X-Men world, and I think if this story had come out just a couple years later, he might have been able to have produced a better story without having to work so hard to fit it within the confines that someone else has set up. And because it's set within the confines of Bendis' X-Men world, I don't like this story as much for reasons that I've already talked about. So that's something, if you are a big fan of the post-Avengers vs. X-Men comics, if you really like all those and you haven't read this because you weren't sure if you should, I would recommend that you read this. Otherwise, if you like the X-Men being more friendly with each other, if you like the X-Men when they don't want to kill each other, I would say you could give this book a very hard skip. So those are my thoughts on X-Men No More Humans. I hope that you guys liked this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys later in the week with some other videos. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.